I got to follow that? Gosh. You guys always, like, put me after the coolest things ever. Like, Marsha's rap. Like, that was hard to follow. Well, I'm going to do my best. Well, I'm Cody Morehead. I'm the associate pastor here, and I'm the pastor over Next Gen Ministries, which is birth through college age. So if you've never met me before, hello. I tried to prep you guys a little bit before and tell you, like, it's going to be really boring today. So, because here's what I think. If your expectations are here, then there's nowhere to go but up, right? Like, no matter how bad I do, you're going to be like, that wasn't as bad as he said it was, right? So that's my thought is, today, we're going to take a little bit of a journey. And what I want to do is I want to maybe give you a different perspective on Christmas and the story of Christmas than maybe you've ever heard before. Okay, and I want to change your thought process a little bit on the Bible stories that you've read surrounding the birth of Jesus and help you understand a little bit of the backstory and history. I know, snooze button, it's really hard to listen to history, right? But I was a huge history buff, I love history, and I hope I can make it fun for you today. But if not, I already told you it wasn't going to be good. So, right, we're on the same page? All right, good. So, here's the deal. Something that I want to tell you before we go down this road together. Just I want to clarify this because everything I say after this is important. One, I believe that the Bible is inerrant and infallible. Okay? And I want to explain that to you if you don't understand what those two words mean. I believe that the Bible is without error. Okay, that everything that is put in the Bible was put there very specifically for a very specific purpose, and that there is not a word unchecked. Okay, I also believe that the Bible is infallible, which means that nothing in it is false. Okay, now stick with me. But I also believe that people's interpretation of the history, the culture, the author, and the audience is not. Okay? I think for years and years, we've had a lot of people teach us about the Bible. And let me tell you something. Can I blow your mind for a second? You were taught the Bible by someone who was taught the Bible as a child. Right? You were taught the Bible as a child, and you were taught the Bible by someone who was taught the Bible as a child. And so one thing that I need you to understand is that there is a lot of research and a lot of history surrounding the Bible, and the Bible is woven throughout history. Okay, we know that the events that happen in the Bible happen through history because there's much documentation to support it. And so as we walk down this path together, I want you to understand something. I may change your mind, or you might just get angry at me, I don't know. I may change your mind about what you might know surrounding the history of the Gospels, okay? So is everybody ready? You ready to put on your thinking caps for a little bit? You ready to buckle in with me? This is a lot of stuff. I promise I'll try and make it good. All right, so here's the first thing I want to tell you. Okay, what is believed to be true is that the earliest gospel was written between 30 to 50 years after Jesus physically walked the earth. That means 30 to 50 years after Jesus was here on this earth was the time when the first gospel was put together that we know as the book of Mark. Okay, so 30 to 50 years after Jesus had lived and done all the miracles he had done was when we know the first gospel to have been put together. That's a lot of time. Doesn't that seem like a lot of time? Like logically you're thinking like, yeah, that doesn't make sense, right? Right, how would they have known all this stuff? Well, I want to break that down, and I want to help because I think we need to have a little bit of an investigative process, okay? And so I've asked three wonderful people to join me today on stage, and so I'm going to ask them if you guys could come up now, and I want to interview them and kind of teach you guys what an investigative process looks like and how people whose their job is to do this, how they figure out what the truth is, okay? You guys with me? So I'm going to invite them up here. This is Jake and Kat Rowe and Brian Ferguson. Can you guys give them a big round of applause? They're serious because they're like, he gave us a list of questions, but we know him. So, okay. So first, I'm going to ask, just share who you are and what you guys do, and why I asked you to be here. That's a good one.
My name is Brian Ferguson. I work for the state of Michigan as a special agent for the Attorney General. I've been with them for about a year. Before that, I was a detective for a police department in West Virginia.
I'm Kathleen Rowe. I was in U.S. Army Intelligence. I was trained as a human resource collector, which in layman's terms is an interrogator.
Good on.
That's all that.
My name's Jake Rowe. I did the same thing as my wife in human intelligence collections.
Yeah. Okay, so I've asked them up here because I thought there were probably not, and if you're in this group and I didn't know about you, I apologize, but I didn't think there were probably any three better people to talk to about how to get down to the truth, right? There are three people on stage right now that their job is to figure out and sort through a lot of details to figure out the truth. And so, Jake, I want to ask you, so in your line of work, right, when you were in Army Intelligence, right, to get to the bottom of a situation and to find out what was true, what would you do? Could you walk us through that?
First thing, figure out the questions that are unknown about the situation. Find a person or persons that has access to that information. From there, it's always direct questioning, 5 W's and 1 H, which are who, what, when, where, why, and how. From there, you keep running those questions until you get I don't knows or you figure out the answer. You keep repeating this process and start to look for information that's lining up first and focus on the finer details the further you get into the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and so Kat, in that, how would you determine who was the most valid to be interviewed in that batch?
First, I would take a group of people, and you would have to look at who has the first-hand accounts. I don't want stories of he said, she said, oh, I saw this guy who said he saw this. I don't want any of that information. I want people who saw it. I want them who were there before, during, or after the event. And then I would separate them out and see who has the pertinent information for what I'm looking for. Just because somebody was right there doesn't mean they saw what I want to know.
Yeah, perfectly. Okay, so Brian, if you had a lineup and you had to narrow it down, what would be the first step of making sure that you could get the right information?
Well, the first thing you want to do is look at the facts of what you have in front of you first. See if you can narrow it down to a suspect that you want the eyewitness to potentially identify. Most state procedures are pretty strict on how a eyewitness identification, a lineup, is administered, basically to prevent false identification. So a lot of times there's a lot of legwork. You want to make sure you're presenting, I'm pretty sure this is the suspect. That's what you want to be showing to the potential witness. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely, that's huge. All right, so Jake, walk me through the process of interviewing someone to retain the truth.
Same as before, you're still using the 5 W's. You're not asking open-ended questions or trying to lead them into the answers you're looking for. Keep asking until there's no more information, and keep circling back to try to ask the question in a different manner to see if their story starts to vary.
And Kat, how would you determine if somebody's lying?
There's 3 main ways that you could do it. The first is the most well-known, which is body language. You look at their speech patterns. Are they stuttering, which isn't usual for them? Are they sweating a lot? Are they just having a hard time answering your questions and making eye contact? The second way is you can ask them questions that you already know the answer to. So you've talked to somebody else in the same situation. You've already gotten information you know to be true, and then you ask questions pertaining to that information and see how their answer compares. And then the third way would to be redundant or repeating questioning. You ask the questions and then you circle back around, rephrase the question, and see how they answer it, if it's the same or different.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. So Brian, if you have your lineup and people have discrepancies in their stories, how do you figure out what is the truth?
Well, if you have 2 different people saying it's 2 different suspects, that is a problem. But one of the things you want to go through is go back to your evidence. Look at your evidence. What's the evidence suggest? What can I corroborate from video, other witness statements, other information? Evidence can be anything these days, especially with electronic evidence. It varies widely. Yeah. So you want to go back and look at your evidence and figure out what corroborates who is most likely telling the truth based on what my investigation beforehand has found out.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just ask this real quick. If you're doing a lineup, you would all agree, like, you expect discrepancies, right? Like, if you have a lineup of 10 people, you're going to expect their stories to be different, correct?
to some extent, but ultimately you want to get to the who did it.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so if you would all agree on that, like eyewitness accounts would normally contain some discrepancies, right? Why is that the case? Shouldn't everybody's testimony just be the same? What do you think, Dick?
No, there's always going to be the discrepancies just for everyone remembers things differently, and when you remember, you actually lose some of the finer details because your mind sometimes tries to streamline what it thinks is the pertinent information.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Kat, what is important to understand when interviewing people and finding those discrepancies?
When you're interviewing people, there likely is going to be some discrepancies. Hopefully the bigger issues are not having discrepancies. But when you interview somebody, you're accessing a memory. People view things different ways. They see things different ways. So somebody might be focusing on what kind of flowers are at a wedding while somebody focused on what kind of plates were at the wedding. So they might not remember those fine details. So you want to be able to pull the similar threads of information from each of the stories to kind of put together the big picture.
So really, you're looking at the big picture and what is similar across the whole lineup, right? Okay, so Brian, this is the last one. How does all this really help detectives and interrogators in their process to kind of like suss out the truth?
Well, like Kat was saying, everybody has a different perspective when they're coming to tell their story about what happened. Ultimately, because everybody's different. Ultimately, you don't want their stories to be exactly the same, because then you have the problem of, did they collude beforehand and get together and get their stories to match? That can be a problem too. Is this person making up this story or just telling the same story as this person to make them sound more credible? Obviously, if there's those discrepancies, there's differences in it. It helps with the pattern of truthfulness.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. Give them another big round of applause. Thank you. You guys did great. Thank you. That wasn't so bad, was it? No, it wasn't. Yeah. I even stuck to the script. You're welcome. I'm going to trip over these, so I'm moving them. So here's the deal. You have that knowledge and information. You're going to be like, oh, Cody, what was the point of that? Like, that was cool, but what was the point of that? Well, let me give you a very brief history lesson. I think this is really important, okay? I want to tell you about first century Palestine, the area that Jesus would have lived in Jerusalem, okay? And I want you to understand something. I'm going to ask a leading question. How many of you know who was in power at the time that Jesus was living on this earth? Who was in power? Do you know what government? The Romans, right? The Romans, right? We all know, it's the Romans, right? So the Romans were in power, and specifically when the Gospels began to be written, starting with Mark, all right, in what we believe to be about 50 A.D., okay? We know that Nero was in power, okay? And I just want to give you a little bit of history here on Nero, okay? Nero was like the worst villain ever. Okay, Nero brought Christians out into the middle of the square and had them drawn and quartered. He had them eaten by dogs. He had them used as personal, torches, basically. He'd have their limbs cut off and wrap things around them and have people carry their limbs around lit up like torches. We're all on the same page. That's kind of not a good thing, right? Nobody's like, yeah, no, okay, we got to talk afterwards. That's really weird. But it's a bad thing. We're all in agreement. Nero was a bad dude. He was against Christians. In fact, at one point, Nero had outlawed any material that was oriented with the Christian faith. And there's a reason for that, because in Roman culture, they gave to their household gods. That's how they appeased their gods. They gave to their household gods. And in the market squares, in their temples, everybody was required to come and give an offering to the gods that were part of the Roman pantheon. Okay? So if you were a Roman citizen, you were expected that you were going to come and you were going to give an offering to the Roman gods in the middle of the square. That's what you did. Okay? And the problem with that was there was only one religion that was exempt from that, and that was the Jews. The Jews were exempt from that because they had very clearly clearly communicated with the Roman government when they came into the provinces that they would not be allowed to do that because of their religious beliefs. And the Romans were okay with that because the Jews paid a very high tax. Okay? They were totally fine with that. So, given what we know about Nero and his distaste for Christians and his like of Jews, it's no wonder that we have a lineage that happens, this crazy thing that happens where we have the fires of Rome in 64 AD. And I want to tell you something. The fires of Rome were terrible. They decimated half of a city, okay? And they were likely caused by Nero. Many scholars agree that Nero probably started the fires himself because afterwards he built this humongous palace on the ruins. And it was probably orchestrated by Nero to begin with. But do you know what Nero did? Nero was like, the Christians did it. So not only did Nero hate Christians, but Nero sparked hatred for Christians within the Roman culture. In one of the most volatile times in the existence of Christianity, we were the most hated people in the world. In fact, if you had been found with Christian literature in your possession, you could be killed on the spot. No trial, nothing. Killed on the spot if you were in a Roman province. Did you know that? That's craziness. From about, I believe, 55 AD till well into the 90s, this was the practice. Okay? And I want to tell you something. This is the craziest part about all this. Very few people could read or write. In fact, most could not. So the fact that Nero made a law about people having literature, it was crazy because most of the people couldn't even read it. What do you think the literacy rates were? What do you think, like 20, 30%? 5 to 7. In the first century Rome, it was 5 to 7% literacy. That meant that only about 5% of the people could read. And that's a really nice estimate, okay? It's probably more like 3% in most of the provinces. This actual statistic is not including the university towns that existed within the Roman provinces, okay? So 5 to 7% is a really generous estimate. Almost everyone could not read or write. That was the case. They bartered, they traded. It was very well known that people were heralded for their ability to speak versus reading and writing. Do you know what sect could read and write very well? The Jews. The Jews from a very early age were taught how to read and to write, and they had oral traditions, which meant that they passed down what they knew, not just in written word, but also to their sons and their daughters, and they passed on the things that they knew to their households so that they would remember what was happening. So the Jews had a market on this, right? So the Jews and the intellectual crowds of Rome knew how to read and write. And in this terribly volatile time in history, written materials were priceless. And they were actually really hard to come by. The only groups that kept them were the Jews. They kept scrolls and scribes around. They kept written word of their faith. The Pentateuch, for the most part, had been written down and saved. A lot of the prophets that you see after the first 5 books of the Bible, they didn't necessarily keep in high regard until the Council of Nicaea in 412 AD. There's a lot of details you don't know to know, but I just want you to understand that there are things that we don't understand about the coming together of the Scripture. And I want to emphasize this again, okay? Because I really need you to understand this. Possession of written Christian material was carried a penalty of death without trial. I don't even think that in the 21st century we understand what that means. We don't understand how barbaric that, because we live in America, and this is this is crazy. We have freedom of religion. Oh, we can't do that, right? They can't do that to me. Well, guess what? In Rome, they could. No warning. If your house was raided and you had any paraphernalia related to Jesus or the Christian faith, you could be drawn out from your houses and killed. I know it's a real bummer. I'm sorry that I have to bring this to you today, right? You were expecting a happy sermon. This is a really big bummer. But I need you to understand these things because it sets the tone for how important the Gospels are. in a time where it was such a crime to even possess written Christian material, there was a group of men and apostles who were putting and compiling these things together. That's pretty nuts. And we get scared to share our faith with people at the bank. Just having written material. Here's a layout. I want to show you the Gospels. This is when most, there's different scholars believe different things, but many scholars believe in this to be the definitive timeline of when the Gospels were written. The first would be Mark, and that's circa 50 AD, okay? Matthew came next, and then Luke. Luke was from 70 to 80 AD, and then John was much later. Some accounts even say that John's Gospel was not written until about 150 AD. That's how late they believe John's Gospel was written. So the truth is that the Gospels were written much longer after Jesus' life here on earth than some of us really believe. Do you know the first books of the Bible, the first books of the New Testament to actually be written down were Paul's letters to the church? That's kind of crazy. Because the Bible's not put together in a chronological order, right? Like they don't timestamp it. So we don't always realize these things. But the first thing that was to be put in as the apostles' teachings was most likely from Paul, Peter, and Barnabas. Okay? I know this is really dry history. I'm sorry. I'm getting through it. I want to get through it as quickly as I can. But you need to understand these things because they're important for you to understand something. Here's something I want to focus on. I want to focus on, out of the four of the Gospels, I want to focus on Luke. And I'm going to tell you why. Because Luke was not a Jew. Luke was a physician. And Luke was not writing to Jews. Luke was writing to Gentiles. How many of you are Jews? Okay, then you're all Gentiles. Right? So Luke was one of us writing to one of us. It's the only gospel like that. Okay? The rest were mostly Jews writing to Jews or Jews writing to Gentiles. We need to understand that because Luke is vital to us understanding why our Christian faith is so important. And I'm going to tell you why. Okay? And the reason I brought those three up here is this. Luke would have gone through hundreds of eyewitness accounts to find the truth. Hundreds. Not to mention the texts that he would have gone through to figure out and suss out the truth of the life of Jesus. And many scholars believe that Luke was not an eyewitness account. Many scholars believe that most of the Gospels were not an eyewitness account of Jesus' life. That they were a compilation of many, many people being interviewed and data being collected. And so when we sit up here and we see this panel of people who knows how to do an interrogation process, we sit up here and we see all these people who know what they're talking about when they're talking about figuring out the truth of a matter. They would expect discrepancies. They would expect it. It's just normal. Okay? That doesn't mean that they are not true. That does not mean that they are false or that those words are not in there for a specific reason. That's why I wanted to tell you I believe in the inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture. But what I do think it does lend to is that we need to understand the volatility and the atmosphere that the Gospels came to be. Because this story that we're telling and this season of the year, it's important that you understand why you believe what you believe. And it's important for you to understand how hard it was for this thing to stay alive called Christianity. So I want to read this to you. In Luke 1, Luke says this. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Now, I want to focus on that, because here's the deal. Luke's life was in danger in so many ways. First of all, Theophilus was not a person. It was actually sort of a code word. It actually means friend of God or loved by God. And what many scholars believe is that Theophilus was a Roman centurion. So Luke was writing to a Roman centurion at the height of an empire that wanted to kill him. Do you realize the monumental aspect of what Luke was trying to do? Luke was like, hey, I know you'll probably kill me for giving this to you, but here you go. What? That's crazy. Luke was like, hey, you know what would be great? If I just hand this in to the officials. Here, just kill me now. Right? No. Luke believed in the gospel so much. He believed in the life of Christ, in the story of Christ, so much that he was willing to do research in a time where research would have been banned on the material he was trying to find, where asking questions around could have gotten him killed. He was trying to figure out what the life of Christ looked like and give proof to a Roman centurion who would easily turn him into the government and have him killed, and he did it anyway. Luke was a Gentile speaking to a Gentile. It was so important for Luke to get the word out about what he knew because he knew that it was the most important thing in the world. And Luke carries the biggest and best definition and explanation of Jesus' birth. Second would be Matthew. You know, Mark doesn't even talk about it. And John kind of talks about it in a roundabout way. This is crazy. To me, as I was doing this research, I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, you ever have that moment like where you're like, oh, I wish I wouldn't have read that because now I feel convicted? You know, like, I was like, ah, come on. Like, I wish I didn't know this stuff now. Luke's life was in danger in so many ways. And I think sometimes when we think about Christmas, we just think about, oh, it's baby Jesus. Do you know that you wouldn't know about this if Luke had not risked his life? I mean, yes, we'll go with this. Well, I believe that God would have got us the Gospels no matter what. Okay, I'm going to say that. But can you just imagine for a second if Luke did not put his life on the line, that we wouldn't have this celebration. You wouldn't be able to buy your kids gifts or throw empty boxes in the fire. That one is funny. Let me just tell you, you should all do that. Wrap empty boxes, and then when they're bad, throw them in the fire. Tip for all of you. The truth is, Luke did things that we will never do. He did things we'll never do. Like, I'll be honest with you, I'm not even ashamed to say it. Like, I'm not, if all of a sudden Christianity became illegal, and like, I was like, it was illegal to have Bibles in your house, and so on and so forth, like, I really had to think about this. I don't know what my response would be. We just don't even understand. We don't understand that culture. We don't understand the price that Luke was paying, or the fact that Luke could have been killed. Like, we just don't even, we don't even comprehend that. When we think about the story of Jesus, all we think is like, oh, baby Jesus and the wise men, oh, presents. Like, right? Frankincense and myrrh. Oh. Like, that's what we think. Like, and white baby Jesus. Like, can we just say, he was Middle Eastern. Okay, I'm just going to say that. Like, white baby Jesus, he was Middle Eastern. I know you want to hear that. Yeah, he's Jewish. Like, Luke put his life on the line because it was so important for him for us to understand the love of Jesus was for everybody. Did you get that? Matthew wrote to Jews because Matthew was a tax collector in a Jewish sect, and Matthew understood. If you read Matthew's gospel, you read the genealogy, Matthew was just basically trying to prove to the Jews like Jesus was legit. That's why the genealogy was for. Like, hey, I want you to see this is he's from the line of David, and you guys have been waiting for Messiah, and like this dude like raised from the dead. I don't know how you don't get it. Like, that was Matthew's gospel, right? You're like, oh, what are all these names? Like that was what that was for. But Luke didn't have to do that. Luke wasn't a Jew. Luke didn't know the history as much. Luke didn't have to understand all the Jewish traditions or the things that went into being a Jew. Luke just realized, hey, this thing Jesus did, it's really important. It changed my life, and I want it to change everybody's life. And it was so important to him. Luke's account of Jesus' birth is incredible. It starts in Luke 2. Okay, and what I would recommend, here's my, I'm going to give you homework, okay? I'm sorry. I'm going to give you homework. Okay, I recommend that you read Luke 1 and Luke 2. Okay, go home. It won't take you but 10 minutes. Read it. You're going to read like about Zechariah and Elizabeth, and you're like, I don't even know what this means. Like, well, okay, listen. Just read the first 2 books of Luke and understand what Luke had to do to get those into our hands and understand the price that it could have cost him. And then eventually, we believe that it probably did. It'll rock your world. You'll read it completely differently than you've ever read it before. I guarantee it. I did. I was like, oh, come on, seriously? It's like that punch in the gut. Like, you could do better, you know? Listen, I know you feel that too. Like, don't leave me up here stranded. Like, here's the truth. This is all of this. Would you risk your life to write something that wasn't true for no political or financial gain? That's enough for me right there, okay? Like, either these dudes were totally crazy or they were onto something. And I'll tell you what, we have schools, we have hospitals, we have churches, we have the freedom to express ourselves in this great country, and I'll be honest, it's all because of that. And here's what helps too. When we know what matters most, what matters more. I mean, listen, I know we've all done, we live in America, okay? It's really easy to be a Christian in America. I'll just be honest with you, okay? Really super easy. Okay? You get to wake up and not have to worry about anybody coming to your house and beheading you. I mean, that's some privilege right there, okay? That's difficult. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean for the church? What does this mean for Heart of the Lakes? What does this mean for you, okay? I hope this sets the tone for the rest of this series, okay? Here's what I believe. The story of Jesus' birth gives us hope for our lives. Luke suffered, Matthew suffered, Mark suffered, John suffered, Paul suffered, Jesus suffered, the disciples suffered. When they became apostles, they suffered even more. They killed him, just so you know. That's how it ended for them, right? The story of Jesus' birth gives us hope. Because guess what? We don't have to live in a world like that anymore. And that's because of Jesus. We don't have to live in a world where we're terrified for our lives every time that we talk about this. I can stand on this stage. It's great. I get to stand on the stage, act crazy, and tell you guys about a bunch of history. You almost fell asleep because it's warm in here, and I get it. But I try not to make it boring. And here's the other thing. Jesus' birth was so radical that it reshaped the world. The culture that they lived in, the information that they had to fight to achieve and to get in their lives, like Jesus reshaped that world. Because those Christians continued to live their lives loving the Lord. Those Christians continued to live their lives and share the love of Christ with other people. And Gentiles, like Luke, would go on to change the entire face of the world. Because they knew that what Jesus had done was real and they bought into it. Have you bought in?
Yes.
I hope it changes your life. Let's pray. God, thanks so much for today. God, we don't always think about what it took. During the Christmas season, God, a lot of times we get festive. I do too. I know I'm guilty of it. But God, we just ask that you could help change our hearts and our minds, that you could give us an appreciation for what it takes for us to be able to celebrate this wonderful holiday, that you can give us an appreciation of what happened in history that allowed us to be able to serve you and love you and worship you so freely. And God, I ask all these things in your name. Amen.